systems, okay? And he starts off with the case of the waterfall. You've got a factory owner, got a waterfall on their land, and they're lucky because the waterfall can be used to harness the energy from the water to drive a turbine, to put belts on it to run the machinery, so he doesn't need to buy coal and a steam locomotive and so on, right? So this is a gift of nature being converted into some form of production relationship. Okay. Now Marx's theory of rent is a labour theory of rent. He holds on to this all the way through. So what he says, the factory with the waterfall, in that factory the workers are able to produce more commodities, they're more productive than the workers in a normal factory without a waterfall. Okay, so the existence of the waterfall and its connection with the production process, with the labour process, allows the workers to be more productive, which in turn means that their commodities can be sold cheaper by that factory owner than by his competitors, which in turn means that he can get a surplus profit. So Marx's theory of rent is based on this idea of it's a part of the surplus value which is produced by the workers. Okay, this is the first and important concept. So what you've got here is an example, an illustration of how different natural circumstances can feed in to increasing the profitability of a concern. So if you take, then he extends it to agriculture, okay? So you have a capitalist farmer and a landowner. The capitalist farmer can, the workers working for a capitalist farmer can produce more turnips or get more milk or so on, depending on how well the grass grows. The natural fertility of the land is converted into them being more or less productive, okay? So they can sell their commodities at lower or greater cost. Now the other thing that changes the profitability of the land is how much capital is invested, and the third factor in Marx's theory of rent is what about the landlord, okay? And Marx says, look, I'm only talking about capitalism here, I'm not developing a theory pre-capitalist, right? This is very historically specific. He's absolutely, you know, he labours the point tremendously, right? He's saying, I'm assuming we've got developed capitalism, and in developed capitalism we've still got a landowning class. And just because it's a landowning class, just because of this property relationship, the landowners can take a portion of the surplus value. They don't produce anything, it's coming from what the workers produce, okay? So what the workers produce is the basis of the average profit of the farmer, the capitalist farmer, plus the rent of the landowner, okay? And then he goes on to connect this with his overall theory of how different sectors of production connect together. But the possibility in Marx for this absolute rent, he calls it, is based on the fact that the organic composition of capital in agriculture is lower than other sectors of the economy. And we haven't got time, we can talk about it in discussion, but he's basically connecting his theory of rent with the dynamics of agriculture and the rest of the capitalist system, okay? Now in Das Kapital, Marx talks about mining in kind of like very cursory terms. He's got a more extensive discussion in theories of surplus value, but he's basically saying, yeah, mining's the same, okay? Right, now, what you've got is the concept then of a class relationship which has got a working class, an agricultural working class, a capitalist class, the farmer, and a landowning class, okay? And he talks about how, you know, bourgeois conceptions factorialize these different class relationships. Now let's go back to South Africa, right? And the development of mining in South Africa went through two phases. One was diamonds and the other one was gold, right? And very quickly, diamond production very quickly got rid of the landowning interest, okay? Because they had to reorganize diamond production to make it possible for they basically dug a great big hole in the ground, and all the walls were falling in, and they had to change the property rights, and the rights of the landowner were completely obliterated, okay, in this colonial or relationship, okay. And so what you get is the expansion of the surplus value which is available to the active capitalist, the mine-owning capitalist in this case, right? And it's a very important point, and this is what I think is new. I think what I'm saying is new. What I'm saying is that monopoly capital emerges with the fusion of the active capitalist with the landowner. That's one of the things that takes place, as well as the question of finance capital. And I mean, we can see in Lenin's Imperialism, he talks about rentier capitalism, right? But he doesn't really develop the idea, okay? Well, I'm saying there is an interesting part of this. If you look at the production process and the class relations in the oppressed society, there is, because it's colonial capital, it dominates everything else. And why should it share anything with any landowner? It doesn't need to, right? It appropriates all the surplus value, all the differential productivity of the workers under its control. That's the first thing that happens. And the second thing that happens is there's a very marked oppression of the majority of the working class in the mines. Okay? So the European miners who go there for, or actually Australian and American miners as well, they went from Cornwall, from Australia and so on, right? They were paid a 50% premium. So they were paid European wages plus 50%. The African miners were paid about a third of what the European miners were paid in the diamond mines. Okay? And they built compounds, they built essentially a prison system to control the African workforce. So the profitability of the diamond mines was also based on this very sharp differentiation between a sort of emerging supervisory, inverted commas, skilled white miners and the mass of the African black miners who did most of the actual physical work. Okay? And this distinction becomes even more acute with the introduction of gold mining, which happened about 20 or 30 years later in the 1890s. And what you get in the gold mines of Witwatersrand, now Johannesburg, is they worked out that there was this big reef of gold which they could mine. The only way they could mine it is if they employed African labour at a wage rate lower than they were already paying the diamond workforce, okay? Diamond miners, right? So the differential between the white wages and the African wages at some points gets as much as 10 to 1. I mean, they depress even further African wages in order to make it possible and profitable to dig the gold out. And there's an awful lot of technical issues, not technical, there's an awful lot more detail we can go into there. And it's really interesting, right? Because what you get is very quickly 200,000 African miners. The gold mines of South Africa were a major engine of generating surplus value for British imperialism. I mean, it was, so what you have is African wage labour on the one hand, on the other hand you have the City of London, that's where most of it ends up, okay? So you have an oppressive relationship with wage labour, which is central, a fulcrum of British imperialism. Now, how do we explain this in value terms? And this is where, again, this is a second area where I think there's a sort of a theoretical challenge. There's quite a good literature about mining in South Africa. It's quite an advanced developed literature which peaked in the mid-1970s. There was a discussion in some degree of polemic with the ANC and the South African Communist Party, from Marxists to the left of the South African Communist Party, who was saying, look, apartheid isn't just about the Boers, the old farmers, it's a modern form of capitalism. They talked about racial capitalism in particular, trying to stress the connection between racial oppression and the specificities of the emergence of capitalism in South Africa. And so you get a quite high level of literature to start off from. I mean, there's a lot of materials available on this, and it's good. But if you look at even that material, there's two issues there. One is their main focus, of course, was writing about, okay, what are we going to do in South Africa, which is quite understandable. Whereas my interest is, what does this situation in South Africa tell us about what's happening in imperialism as a whole at this stage? So it's a slightly different interest, right? And the second thing is, they were orthodox Marxists, and they were trying to say we should apply capital to South African conditions. And what I'm saying, and this is where the what's the word, prepotente, the arrogant bit comes in, these conditions show that we have to go beyond das Kapital, right? And I want to explain why, and I'll probably, I don't know how time's going, but I'll make this point and we'll see where we are with time, okay? I don't know how many of you are familiar with Das Kapital, right? But if you look at volume 1 of Kapital, he develops a whole concept of absolute surplus value.